So I've been reading quite a bit about industrialization in the United States in the 19th century, from the period stretching roughly from the age of Jackson to the end of the Gilded Age with the assassination of McKinley and the inauguration of Teddy Roosevelt as president. This is an interesting era because it saw immense economic growth and change. It saw America transform from a largely rural country of citizen independent farmers into an industrial superpower and go from being a backwater that Europeans would laugh at to being the world leader in science, technology, industry, and finally eclipsing its former colonial overlords. It's also interesting because it was a time of great self reflection and conflict within the United States as to what sort of country they would want to be. In the generation immediately after the revolution, there was a lot of inertia left over. In a lot of states, you didn't even have universal male suffrage yet. The concept that there was an aristocracy dictated by birth and manners and that sort of thing was still very set, even within electoral laws in different states. What we would tend to think today of as the good old boys club. And that was true throughout the country, not just in the South. And so the question was, how is this country going to work? Are we going to have an elite? What's going to happen? The Jeffersonian, Jacksonian Democratic Republican Party view of looking at the world was that America was an equal nation of citizen farmers, of citizen craftsmen, where everybody kind of had an equal shot, an equal opportunity. They tended to believe in laissez-faire capitalism, the idea of the American dream, rugged individualism, low taxes, that sort of thing. And the idea was almost in some cases a romantic one that America would remain this society where everyone was middle class or petty bourgeoisie or citizen farmers or something, and you would have this kind of republic of equality. Although interestingly not enforced by government, in fact, it tended to be very unsure and skeptical of state power. Then you had a competing vision brought about by the Federalists, National Republicans, Whigs, and eventually Republicans that government should take a leading role in society to create public wealth, to create public institutions, that there was a major role for the state. Beyond that, that society had a natural hierarchy within it, and that it was a duty of the people of better breeding or better character or better intelligence to rule over those who were lesser than them in a benevolent fashion, in a form of noblesse oblige for the good of the lower classes. And once we get into modern capitalism, we get a lot of wrenches very much thrown into this. Because to the Whigs and the Federalists and eventually the Republicans, their idea of aristocracy or their idea of an elite isn't a plutocracy. It's not based on how much money you have. It's based on character or breeding or something to that effect. And to the Democrats, well, they do support laissez-faire capitalism. In a lot of cases, men like Vanderbilt were seen as the ideal of the self-made man who was able to become rich without interference for the government. The idea of all these trusts controlling society raised a question that we see a lot today among conservatives. Is it really better to not have government tyranny, but instead to have tyranny by private corporations? And if you increase the size of government to try to deal with that, does that actually resolve the problem, or does that just add another layer of oppression? And so you have all these different narratives and all this different back and forth, and very quickly the debate becomes very muddied by the whole industrial revolution in America and the rise of the men who were known as the robber barons. So I've been reading a couple books about this. Specifically, I read a couple years back Titan, A Life of Nelson D. Rockefeller. I also read just a week or two ago American Rascal, a biography of Jay Gould, the Wall Street financier. And I'm about 2/3 of the way through the book, The First Tycoon, The Epic Life of Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, these men tend to be called the robber barons because they were able to take control of large portions of the U.S. economy. Standard Oil, I believed, at one point controlled it might have been a majority of the world's oil production. So I think it had a virtual monopoly on oil production in the United States, and America produced most of the world's oil, if memory serves correctly, up until I think World War II, actually. You had Gould and Vanderbilt, who owned immense amounts of the nation's railway networks, to the point where they were eventually able to kind of conglomerate all the different rails together to create a truly continental system. Vanderbilt more or less created the steamship industry by single-handedly and had a virtual monopoly on it at various points in time. And so you'll have these men who had amounts of money that could only be imagined of in a previous era. I mean, you had lots of wealthy people who owned land and artwork and farmland and had government bonds and stuff. But the concept of the millionaire, somebody with just a mountain of cash and having it invested in stocks and bonds and all this other stuff, was just something that largely came out of nowhere. And there was a perception, somewhat justified, that a lot of the things that these men had done to get to their position had been very shady, very sleazy, very dishonorable, that they had backstabbed people, they had sold people out, they had done a lot of harm to the public and to the nation as a whole. And once again, it kind of goes to those two competing visions of the country, wherein the Democrats saw this as an overthrow of their conception of the republic of equal middle-class white males, and the Republicans saw this as a taking the way of power from the best men and putting it in the hands of the richest men. What also complicates this further is most of the robber barons were from very humble backgrounds. Jay Gould came from an extremely poor background. Rockefeller, I don't even think he really knew his father. His father was like a con artist or something. And Vanderbilt was from a farmer family on Staten Island. Men who basically made all their money on the basis of their own wits, their own ruthlessness, and their own innovation. But the book I read on Jay Gould, I think, raised a very interesting question. And I'm not sure exactly how to answer it, per se. It's at least, if nothing else, an interesting thing to maybe meditate on. So, I'm not going to go through the whole life of Jay Gould. He was basically the first great Wall Street financier. The whole book is just a mess of insider trading, him scamming people, people scamming him using, spreading rumors to damage the market. It's just an endless stream of nonsense. And by the end of the book, though, in the ending chapter, the author, I think, takes a very interesting perspective and says, okay, so Gould did all this stuff, but at the same time, his efforts built the national railway system. He may have screwed over some of his partners and some of the other Wall Street bankers, but he employed hundreds of thousands of Americans and developed parts of the country that had been completely isolated before and lacking any sort of modern conveniences. Well, Gould wasn't that big a charitable person. Some of the other ones, Mellon, Carnegie, the various people, built libraries all across America. They put immense amounts of funding into medical research, charitable stuff, universities, like I said, science and technology, infrastructure, and they employed millions of people. In my understanding, Standard Oil paid relatively good wages to its employees. And once Ford kind of did his Fordism and restructured it, Ford workers were paid rather well and enjoyed fairly good benefits compared to a lot of other people in the industry. So you could almost argue in a lot of cases the local population would make their living almost entirely off of these men's business, be it the coal mining or manufacturing of train engines or construction projects or all these other things. So did they screw over a lot of people? Yes. Did they cost the public a lot of money and scam government? Yes. But at the same time, the industries that they scam people in wouldn't have even really existed. Like, there wasn't really a steamboat industry before Vanderbilt built it more or less by himself and extended the steamboat industry beyond not just New York, not just the Northeast, but eventually created a steamboat system that went all the way from New York to California, which enabled the settlement of the American West and ultimately kind of tied the country together and made it so that the conquest from the Mexican secession didn't break off. There was a lot of like price gouging and price cutting to try to drive competitors out of business and attempts to form monopolies and a lot of things that we would consider very immoral today. But there wouldn't have been a steamship industry if there wasn't a Vanderbilt. Maybe it would have come along later on, but he did provide a good or a service. He did provide relatively safe, affordable, efficient travel for the general public. And you could argue that him and Gould eventually did the same thing with railroads. And then you have Carnegie with steel and Morgan with banking. And you just kind of go through all the different robber barons, and they more or less created these industries from complete scratch, which employed millions of people, and large portions of the country bear their name from the various charitable donations they built. So, to kind of summarize it and to kind of get back to the point, the author's question is, look, we built statues to politicians, to kings, to queens, to explorers, to generals, but not to businessmen. Because businessmen are evil, they're greedy, they're self-important, they're self-involved. If they do anything good, it's as a side effect of them trying to look better. And he goes, why is it necessarily worse to employ people as part of a money-making enterprise than to employ them as like serfs on your land? Why is it better if a monarch or a president builds a monument with public money than if a capitalist builds a monument with their personal money? You can argue that many people died due to unsafe business practices, but many people have died in public construction projects. Millions of people die in the wars that politicians and nobles and other people who, generally speaking, we have more respect for launch. And they aren't held to the same standard, they aren't held to the same scrutiny. And at the same time, they tend to get more credit for the things they do, largely with other people's money, than what capitalists get when they do with their own money. And once again, I'm not sure if I have an exact answer. Is it more moral to amass tons of money, power, and spend it in blood and treasure to achieve honor or power or glory or one of those abstract concepts, as opposed to just wanting to make bank and to pass the money on to your descendants? I think it's a difficult one, and we can get into an argument about a lot of people will be against this today because a lot of capitalists are parasites who engage in all kinds of currency speculation and stuff like that and don't really produce a good or a service. And a lot of the ones who do fund really unpleasant things that are actively destructive to their nation. But to a certain extent, that kind of misses the point. People from elite families do that. People from what you would generally regard as the aristocracy do that to basically the same extent. But why is it that these other people are considered worse? Is it jealousy? Is it a Christian, a leftover from thing from Christianity where the love of money is evil? I'm not sure, really. But it is interesting. I know when I'm reading the Vanderbilt book, they talk a lot about the first like third of the book or so is him fighting with the various monopolies. So back during the, I guess the age of Jackson and a bit before, particularly in the Northeast, there was a small group of aristocratic families who controlled everything. And you had to basically be one of them, and from their social class, if you wanted to do business with them, if you wanted to get loans, they controlled all the different levels of government. So they could just ask people to pass a law giving them a monopoly over something. And that was kind of an issue that Vanderbilt ran into, was most of the transit routes were government sanctioned monopolies that were not run particularly well. Because there was no competition, there was no incentive to improve. It was slow, dangerous, and expensive. And when he came in there and just started hustling and started getting the boats built on time and started competing, prices went way down, quality went way up, things got faster, technological development just rapidly accelerated. And it was a huge net benefit to the public. Now, a lot of people shit on Vanderbilt because of some of his business practices. He was a massive asshole. Um, he did screw over people and stuff like that. But lots of politicians do much worse things than he ever did, and they get credit for passing a bill that spends someone else's money. And this is, I guess, kind of more of a libertarian argument, but I think it's something that's interesting and something at least worth considering. Is there a place for plutocracy? Is it necessarily a bad thing to have an aristocracy made up of self made men? The problem, though, is you could argue this was kind of a unique period in history. That with the Industrial Revolution occurring, so many new things were coming out that it just presented this opportunity for these new men to come in, to take over from a decadent and lazy ruling class, and to build something completely new. And that a lot of their descendants who inherited their money were incompetent, corrupt, and eventually would start spending the money in ways that actively undermined their country. And so maybe it made sense to be more pro business during the 19th century, but nowadays you really shouldn't. And like I said, it's something I don't really have a strong answer for. It's definitely an interesting period in history, and it's definitely a lot of food for thought. It does kind of remind me something Tywin says on Game of Thrones when he gets confronted about the Red Wedding. Why is it more moral to kill 10,000 men in a pitched battle than to kill a dozen men at dinner? Which is, once again, a very utilitarian, kind of sleazy way of looking at it, but it definitely does have a grain of truth. And if not by wealth, how else are you going to structure society? Because ultimately, there is going to be an aristocracy of sorts. There's going to be people who the ruling class is largely pulled from. And I think it's something that America's just never really come to terms with. I think it's something a lot of countries just never really came to terms with once we collectively decided that everybody was interchangeable. Men, women were the same. People of different races were the same. People of different cultures were the same. And you kind of have a ruling class that's come out of universities, and it's kind of a mess. It's very hard to define who exactly is in control of society now. It's like a weird mixture of bankers and people from political families and academics and journalists, and it's very odd. And I guess once again the question is it better? Is that better, or is it better to just be ruled by a society of people who are able to get things done and produce wealth and achieve things? I mean, I guess there's also stuff like the environment, but I just thought it was something maybe interesting to meditate on and to comment on. So I hope you enjoyed the video. God bless, and lots more exciting content to come.